In a system that tried to box her into stereotypes, Dorothy Dandridge fought for her place and paid the ultimate price. But behind the glamour was a storm of betrayal, abusive marriages, and affairs that ignited scandal across the industry. From childhood trauma to relationships that nearly destroyed her, Dorothy's private life was as dramatic as any role she ever played. This is the untold, unfiltered story of the star who blazed a trail, but couldn't escape the fires it lit. Right from a young age, Dorothy had a very traumatic experience with anything sex-related. It all began back in 1925, when Dorothy was just 3. Her mother, Ruby, had introduced Geneva Williams to the family. Geneva was supposed to help around the house, but she soon became far more than just a house helper. At first, Geneva was strict, in a way that Ruby seemed to approve of. She kept the house in order, managed chores, and ensured the children followed rules. But behind closed doors, her discipline turned into cruelty. As if cruelty wasn't traumatic enough, Geneva also became extremely obsessed with Dorothy's sex life the moment she noticed that men were easily attracted to Dorothy, and the attraction was usually mutual. To curb it, she did everything to suppress Dorothy's sexuality. Before performances, she would go as far as bind Dorothy's chest to conceal her bust. She became so controlling, particularly when it came to Dorothy's romantic life. While touring in England, she refused to believe Dorothy was still a virgin without a physical examination and attempted to force the test on the teenage Dorothy. Fortunately, Dorothy was able to overpower her and knock her to the ground with a punch. That was the last time Geneva ever tried abusing Dorothy. However, the years of abuse had already left a mark that would affect her first love life. Dorothy and Harold's love story began with a teenage crush in 1938. She and her elder sister Vivian had just rebranded from the Wonder Children to the Dandridge sisters, and they had also just added a third person, Etta Jones. This rebranding took them out of their usual churchy tours and into New York, through a gig with the Cotton Club. And it was in New York that she met her love of the life, Harold Nicholas. Harold was a tap dancer and half of a popular crew called the Nicholas Brothers. Many might know them now as some of the most incredible dancers in the world, but back then they were putting in work and fighting the racial stereotypes. Dorothy's angelic face caught his eye, and they were silently in love. But something was coming fast, and it was bent on destroying their romantic story. Soon, the Dandridge sisters were sent on a European tour, but it was cut short due to the beginning of the Second World War. Of course, the couple felt terrible about the war, but they were over the moon to be back together again. Dorothy sang with her sisters, Harold danced with his brother, and their careers continued to soar despite the war. They even featured each other at one point. But after a few years, Dorothy took not one, but 2 steps that changed her life forever. The first was a bold career move that no one saw coming. From the tender age of 3, the Dandridge sisters was her identity. There was nothing she knew other than sharing the spotlight with Vivian and Etta. But Dorothy wanted to be seen beyond a third of a harmony, and even if it meant stepping into uncertainty, Dorothy summoned courage and left the Dandridge sisters. But it was the second decision that people remembered most. In 1942, after 4 years of courtship, she married Harold Nicholas. For Dorothy, this was going to be the beautiful beginning of a life full of wedded bliss. She excelled in every role as a wife. But even though Harold was a good provider, his love of golf and his wandering eye soon put a strain on their marriage. As the absences grew longer, Dorothy began to wonder if she was the problem, and one voice from her past crept back into her mind, whispering that maybe she wasn't enough. Dorothy could feel her marriage to Harold slipping out of her hands. The trauma done to her sexually made her believe she was the reason why Harold took long trips and spent more time with other women. Not only was she worried about their marriage, but the loneliness was beginning to suffocate her. There was only one thing left to do, and that was to have a baby. And so in 1943, when Dorothy found out she was carrying a child, she was ecstatic. For a moment, it felt right, and she now had something that could make their family feel complete and make her husband spend more time at home. Sadly, it took a devastating event for Dorothy to find out how wrong she was. The day Dorothy's water broke, her husband had taken their car to go golfing. She waited and waited, and by the time they got to the hospital, they had taken too long and their baby was in danger. Thankfully, before the end of that day, Harolyn Nicholas was born into the Dandridge Nicholas family. Despite their parents' neglect, she had survived it, but not without consequences. Due to the delay, Harolyn was deprived of oxygen for too long, which affected her brain and left her with irreversible brain damage. If Dorothy felt 50% responsible for the strains in her marriage, then she must have felt 100% guilty for her daughter's condition. She was only 21, and her life had been from one tragedy to another. That was not just it. Harold didn't just ignore her further, he also ignored his daughter too, only visiting her twice in 3 years. While Dorothy was struggling to raise money for Harolyn's care, Harold was still philandering. For the next 8 years, Dorothy lived like a single mother in her marital home until one day she finally filed for divorce. It was a long overdue decision, and perhaps she only divorced him because she needed the court to hold him responsible for her daughter's medical bills. But if that was her plan, then once again, her plans failed. Because Harold refused to pay child support, and by the time she went back to address it in court, he owed her 2 years' worth. Dorothy was low on funds, and she had custody of her daughter. She could no longer provide for the daughter she badly wished for. So even though she didn't want to, Dorothy employed nurses and caregivers to take care of her daughter and return to the spotlight. On the outside, she said, "I've had it. I'll give her up." Inside, I never gave her up. It was myself that I began giving up. At her show in Las Vegas, Dorothy met Peter Lawford. After her total commitment to a man who didn't care, Dorothy was ready to go wild, and Peter was the first man to indulge her. By the time the show finished and the night ended, the duo were in his car, kissing the night away. Peter put his arms around me and began kissing me in a delightful, gallant English style, if kisses can have nationality. I liked being with him. Now, that was the thing. Back in that era, Peter and Dorothy were an impossibility. The difference in their skin tones was like a massive wall between the concept of dating. But Dorothy loved the English, and even though she was so gentle in marriage, she hated racism and always defiantly spoke against it. After all, she was the first black woman to star alongside a white person in a movie. Talk about a trailblazer move.
So when the media ran wild and her name was plastered on headlines, Dorothy was unfazed, already hardened by all the violence and pain in her life. From that year on, Dorothy got involved in several other affairs with men like Harry Belafonte, and especially with the high-profile Austrian director Otto Preminger. Dorothy's relationship with Otto was overly complicated. At first, they hated each other. Dorothy called him ugly, and Otto thought she was just full of herself. But slowly, like most nemesis-turned love stories, the two fell in love. After a life of constantly struggling, Otto introduced Dorothy to a life of comfort. Or, shall we say, Otto forced Dorothy to adapt to his life of comfort? He would tell her what to wear, who to see, where to go, and what to drink. He was always advising her in her career as an actress, and his advice was worth an Oscar, because she did get an Oscar nomination. But Dorothy had once again fallen too deeply in love with this man who kept her a secret. That's right, Dorothy was in a 4-year-long relationship with a married man. He would spend time in her bed but publicly insult her as if he were talking to lesser actors. She even got pregnant for him but was forced by the studio to take it out. It soon began to dawn on Dorothy that while she was hoping he would one day marry her, Otto was tired and hoping for it to end. When their relationship eventually ended, Dorothy said, "I realized that we were in a game. I to get him, he to lose me. I had bitter nights of weeping. No one will ever know how I wept." But if that was how Otto really felt, it doesn't explain the jealousy he felt towards Andre Previn. Before her affair with Otto ended, Dorothy met Andre on set. He quickly became a confidant, and his shoulders were easy for her to rest on. Rumors began to circulate that his shoulders were not the only place Dorothy was resting on, and those rumors soon reached Otto, who was directing on that same set. So when he saw the duo in close contact, he didn't care that his relationship with Dorothy was over. His jealousy took charge, and a fight broke loose. Perhaps that was why Dorothy decided her next relationship wouldn't be with anyone in the Hollywood business. But just like all the other times she tried to plan her life, that decision turned out to be the worst disaster of her life. When Dorothy married Jack Dennison in 1959, it was on the promise of a better and peaceful life. With Otto's influence, Dorothy was rumored to have several affairs, but it wasn't until 1955 that she got into another serious relationship. Jack was a good listener and knew his way with words, but it took Dorothy 4 years to say yes to him. But Jack didn't give up until he got her to the altar. It was also Jack's second marriage, and it happened quietly. The two of them looked so good together and were always happy. They even announced a few months later that they would be adopting 2 kids to add to their family. But it soon occurred to Dorothy that the wedding papers she signed were the gateway to a new type of hell. Jack Dennison was a wolf in sheep's clothing, except that wasn't even his real name. His real name was John Demetlin, and he was well known in Montreal for his chronic womanizing. The reason he changed his name and moved to Los Angeles is unknown, but his intentions towards Dorothy didn't stay hidden for too long. At the time they got married, Dorothy was earning $250,000 a year. Despite how her life had fallen apart after her first marriage, she managed to pick it back up. Maybe that was why it took her so long to settle with Jack, and she should have trusted that instinct. Jack wasn't poor. He owned a nightclub and a restaurant bearing his name. But deep down, he was running in debt, and he saw Dorothy as a gold mine. Not only was he robbing her money, but he was also stealing her talent by making her sing in his failing businesses. With every performance, Dorothy's value dwindled, and by the time she would realize it in 1962, Jack had scammed her heart and left her penniless. Some people killed themselves with drink, others with overdoses, some with a gun. A few hurled themselves in front of trains or autos. I hurled myself in front of another white man. For the next 3 years, Dorothy's life declined terribly. She lost everything and could no longer afford her daughter's caretakers. Dorothy had to move Harlan to a state mental institution, a decision that broke her more than any man did. In 1965, when 42-year-old Dorothy was found dead in her apartment from an overdose of her antidepressants, it was still hard to tell if it was an accident or if for the first time ever, something happened exactly as she planned.
Was Dorothy's unlucky experience with men the reason she took her own life? Or is there more to that tragic incident? Let us know in the comments section below. Also, remember to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more updates. While you're still here, click the video on your screen for more celebrity videos.